In 1908, William Mulholland and 5,000 workers began building a wooden water pipeline 80 miles long across the Mojave Desert. The pipe was made of Douglas fir, bound with iron bands, and ran from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles. The records survive in the Department of Water and Power archives. The aqueduct is still in operation today. That is not a typo. Wooden. A wooden pipe 80 miles long, carrying water across one of the hottest deserts in the United States, built 117 years ago by hand. No steel, no reinforced concrete. No modern pumps. Just Douglas fir, iron bands, mule teams, and 5,000 men working through 5 consecutive summers in temperatures that hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The pipeline was part of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, a 233-mile water conveyance that opened in 1913 and still delivers about 30% of the city's water supply today. The 80-mile wooden section was the longest wooden water pipe ever built in the western United States. Sections of the original wood remained in active service for 90 years. A few segments are still operational today, more than a century after the staves were milled in Oregon and shipped south to the desert. The man in charge was William Mulholland. Today his name is mostly remembered for the road in the Hollywood Hills, or for the Owens Valley water conflict that erupted after the aqueduct opened. But when construction began in 1908, Mulholland was a self-taught chief engineer who had risen from ditch tender to chief engineer of the Los Angeles Department of Water by sheer competence. He had been born in Belfast, Ireland in 1855, the son of a postal clerk. He emigrated to the United States at age 15. He worked as a merchant sailor for 4 years, then drifted west, and arrived in Los Angeles in 1877 at the age of 22. With no money and no formal education beyond grammar school, he took a job as a ditch tender on the Los Angeles Zanjas, the open-channel irrigation ditches that carried water from the Los Angeles River to the orange groves around the city. He read engineering manuals at night. He taught himself trigonometry, surveying, hydraulics, and reinforced concrete by mail-order study. Within a decade, he was a department supervisor. Within 2 decades, he was chief engineer. He had never built anything on the scale of the Los Angeles Aqueduct. Almost nobody had. The engineering question he faced was simple to state and almost impossible to solve. Los Angeles in 1905 had a population of about 200,000. The local water supply was already stretched to its limit. To grow, the city needed a new water source. The Owens Valley, 233 miles north in the eastern Sierra Nevada, had abundant snowmelt and a low elevation gradient that made gravity-fed delivery theoretically possible. But getting that water from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles meant crossing the Mojave Desert, and nobody had ever moved that much water across a desert before. The team that surveyed the route included Mulholland, consulting engineer Joseph Lippincott, former Los Angeles Mayor Fred Eaton, who had quietly bought up Owens Valley water rights years earlier, and hydraulics consultant Frederick Finkel. They mapped a corridor that descended by gravity from the Owens Valley intake at 3,800 feet, through the Alabama Hills, across the Mojave Desert, around the western edge of the San Gabriel Mountains and into the San Fernando Valley north of Los Angeles. The total elevation drop was about 2,300 feet. Gravity alone could move the water. No pumping was required along the original route. That was the breakthrough. If they could build a watertight conduit along the right alignment, the Owens River would flow downhill all the way to Los Angeles by itself. Fred Eaton's role in the project deserves separate attention because the entire aqueduct depended on it. Eaton had served as mayor of Los Angeles from 1898 to 1900. During his term as mayor and after his term ended, he had quietly traveled north to the Owens Valley and purchased water rights and ranch properties from local farmers and ranchers, often at low prices, often without disclosing that he was acquiring the rights on behalf of a future Los Angeles water project. By the time the aqueduct was publicly announced in 1905, Eaton owned or controlled most of the senior water rights along the Owens River corridor. He sold those rights to the city of Los Angeles. The transaction made Eaton personally wealthy. It also made the Owens Valley farmers who had sold to him feel that they had been swindled, because they had sold local water rights to a man they thought was buying ranch land, not realizing the water would be diverted to a city 200 miles south. The political and social conflict that erupted over the Owens Valley water in the 1920s traces directly to this acquisition pattern. The engineering of the aqueduct succeeded. The acquisition story would haunt the project for decades. The Los Angeles bond election that funded the aqueduct was held on June 12, 1907. The voters of the city of Los Angeles approved a $23 million bond issue by a margin of approximately 10 to 1. The bond was the largest single municipal infrastructure bond in American history up to that date. The bond proceeds went directly to the Bureau of Los Angeles Aqueduct, a special construction authority established within the Department of Water for the specific purpose of building the project. The bond was repaid over the following 40 years through Los Angeles water revenues, with the final retirement payment made in 1948. The fact that the city voters approved such a large bond issue with such a wide margin reflects the genuine water crisis Los Angeles faced in 1907 and the public trust in Mulholland personally. Mulholland had spent 10 years building his reputation as the man who could run the Los Angeles water system competently and honestly. The voters trusted him to deliver. The voters also trusted Mayor Eaton and his successors, who had pushed for the aqueduct through 3 consecutive city administrations. The bond passed. The construction began. The water came. The political opposition to the aqueduct, which would later be amplified by the Owens Valley conflict, was almost non-existent in 1907. A small group of San Fernando Valley land speculators, including Harry Chandler of the Los Angeles Times, Henry Huntington of the Pacific Electric Railway, and a syndicate of bankers and real estate developers, had quietly purchased large tracts of San Fernando Valley land in 1905 and 1906, before the aqueduct route was publicly announced. The aqueduct terminus at the San Fernando Cascades would deliver water to the previously dry San Fernando Valley, making the speculators' land enormously valuable. The Los Angeles Examiner published exposes of the syndicate in 1907 and 1908, alleging that the aqueduct route had been chosen specifically to benefit the speculators. Mulholland and the Department of Water denied the allegations. The bond passed anyway. The San Fernando Valley land values rose by roughly 600% over the next decade. The speculators made fortunes. Mulholland received no portion of those fortunes. He stayed on his Department of Water salary, which never exceeded $8,000 per year during his career. The next question was what to build the conduit out of. For most of the route, the answer was concrete, either cast in place or prefabricated tunnel lining. There were 43 tunnels totaling 53 miles. There were 120 miles of unlined open canal in the high deserts where evaporation losses were considered acceptable. There were 2 siphon sections where the pipe had to drop into a canyon and climb out the other side under its own pressure. But for the long flat traverse across the open Mojave, where the ground was too hot and too far from cement supply for concrete, and where steel pipe would have been ruinously expensive to ship, assemble, Mulholland and Finkel chose wood. Specifically, they chose stave pipe construction. Douglas fir staves, milled in Oregon and Washington, shipped south by rail, then assembled in place. Each stave was a long curved plank, like a barrel stave but much larger. The staves were fitted together edge to edge to form a round pipe. Iron bands wrapped the pipe every 3 feet to hold the staves under pressure. The pipe diameter varied from 4 feet at the higher gradients to 11 feet at the lower pressure flatter sections. Stave pipe construction was not new. The technique had been used since the 1860s for low-pressure water and industrial fluid lines. German engineers had pioneered the method for paper mill water supply in the 1850s. Scandinavian engineers had adapted it for hydroelectric penstock construction in the 1880s. American engineers in California had used it for low-pressure municipal water supply in Stockton, Sacramento, and Fresno from the 1870s onward. But it had never been built at the scale Mulholland needed. 80 miles of continuous wooden pipe across an open desert was unprecedented. The engineering question was whether the Douglas fir could survive desert thermal stress for the projected service life of 50 years. The wood would swell when wet and shrink when dry. The iron bands would expand and contract with daily temperature swings. The staves would weather, the joints would settle. Nobody had data on what happened to a wooden pipe of this size after 20 or 30 years in a desert. Mulholland built it anyway. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. The link is in the description below. Now let us walk through what actually happened on the ground in 1908 when the construction camps started moving into the Mojave. The labor force eventually reached 5,000 workers at peak. The crews came from across the country and from overseas. American-born laborers from California and the Southwest. Mexican workers recruited from Sonora and Baja California through labor brokers in the border towns of El Paso, Yuma, and Calexico. European immigrants, including Italians, Greeks, Bulgarians, and a substantial number of Montenegrins, recruited through the Adriatic shipping companies that brought laborers to the American West Coast in the early 1900s. The camps were spread along the construction route in segments of about 10 to 15 miles each. Each camp had a foreman, a cookhouse, a bunkhouse for single men, a small tent city for families, a livery for the mule teams, a blacksmith shop, a tool shed, a supply depot where the materials arrived by rail, a primitive infirmary staffed by a single medical orderly, and in the larger camps a small commissary store. The Southern Pacific Railroad ran a dedicated supply line that delivered Douglas fir staves, iron bands, cement, blasting powder, food and water. Yes, water. The construction crews needed drinking water in volumes that the local desert sources could not supply. So the Southern Pacific brought it in by tank car from the Sierra snowmelt regions to the north. The water arrived at the rail sidings, was transferred to mule-drawn tank wagons, and then distributed to the camp cisterns. Each worker needed roughly 2 gallons of drinking water per day in summer. With 5,000 workers at peak, the daily drinking water requirement alone reached 10,000 gallons. The supply problem was managed, but never solved comfortably. Camps regularly ran short during heat waves. Tank cars were sometimes delayed by track washouts in the high country. The stave pipe construction process started with site preparation. The route had been surveyed, marked, and graded. Surveyors with transit instruments laid out the center line. Mule teams pulling slip scrapers excavated a shallow trench where the pipe would rest. Crushed stone bedding was laid down. Then the assembly began. A traveling assembly crew of 20 to 40 men would arrive at the end of the existing pipe. The Douglas fir staves had been delivered by rail to a nearby siding. The staves were transported by mule wagon to the pipe end. Each stave was approximately 12 feet long, 6 inches thick, and curved to the radius of the pipe. The crew fitted the staves into iron retaining rings that had been pre-positioned along the route. Long oak mauls drove the staves home. Pipe wrenches and banding tools tightened the iron bands. A waterproof joint compound, usually a mix of asphaltic pitch and oakum, was driven into the seams between staves with caulking irons. The work was rhythmic, almost like a piece of factory assembly stretched across the desert. A good crew could install about 30 to 50 feet of pipe per day, depending on the diameter and the terrain. In the lower pressure flat sections of the Mojave, the pipe sat directly on graded earth, partially buried where the ground allowed. In the rising or undulating sections, the pipe was supported on timber cribbing, low rectangular wooden structures that held the pipe just above grade. In a few places where the pipe crossed dry washes or shallow canyons, it was carried on wooden trestles. The trestles were similar in construction to the wooden railroad trestles of the era, with cross-braced bents and stringers. Some of those trestles survive today as ruins in the open desert. The single most difficult engineering feature of the aqueduct was the Jawbone Siphon, where the pipe had to descend into the Jawbone Canyon, cross the canyon floor, and climb up the other side under its own pressure. The siphon required a steel pipe section, not wood, because the pressure at the canyon bottom would have crushed wooden staves regardless of iron banding. The Jawbone Siphon was over 7,000 feet long, with a vertical drop and rise of about 850 feet. The steel pipe sections for the siphon were manufactured in Pennsylvania, shipped by rail to the canyon rim, and lowered to the canyon floor by a temporary cable and winch system the construction crew had rigged. A major scaffolding collapse at the Jawbone Siphon in 1911 killed 3 workers when a wooden falsework structure failed under load. The collapse is documented in the Department of Water and Power accident reports. The bodies were recovered. The siphon was completed. The Jawbone section remains in operation today. The second most difficult feature was the Elizabeth Tunnel through the San Gabriel Mountains. This was a 5-mile bore through hard granite at the southern end of the aqueduct route, the final tunnel before the water reached the San Fernando Valley Cascades. Construction Superintendent John Gray ran the Elizabeth Tunnel crew through 43 months of continuous boring. The tunnel was advanced from both ends simultaneously, with crews working 3 shifts per day, 6 days per week. The geology was treacherous. Fault zones in the San Gabriel granite caused multiple collapses during construction. Heat at the rock face inside the tunnel reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit because of compression of the air by the pneumatic drills combined with the geothermal gradient at depth. Crews drilled in shorter shifts than other aqueduct sections, with longer rest periods between shifts. The Elizabeth Tunnel was completed on time and on budget despite the difficulties. The holing through of the east and west bores in February 1911 was within 2 inches of perfect alignment across the 5 miles. John Gray was awarded a Department of Water bonus of $1,000 for the precision. The Elizabeth Tunnel remains in active service today, carrying the water from the upper aqueduct down to the San Fernando Valley. The Sand Canyon section of the wooden pipeline between the Elizabeth Tunnel and the San Gabriel Reservoir was the longest single uninterrupted run of Douglas fir stave pipe on the aqueduct at approximately 22 miles. The Sand Canyon section is also where the longest surviving original wooden pipe segments remained in service the longest. Sections of the Sand Canyon stave pipe operated continuously from 1913 to 2008, a span of 95 years. The Department of Water and Power finally replaced the last continuous Sand Canyon segment in 2008 with welded steel pipe of equivalent diameter. The original Douglas fir staves removed in the 2008 replacement were donated to the Los Angeles Aqueduct Museum and to several California State University engineering departments for study. The wood, after 95 years of continuous service carrying water under gravity pressure, was still structurally sound in most segments. The iron bands had corroded enough to require replacement. The asphaltic pitch joint compound had become brittle. But the Douglas fir itself, the same wood Mulholland and Finkel had specified in 1909, was still doing its job in the early 21st century. Anyone who has seen the masonry on a 150-year-old bridge knows this. The construction was not just labor, it was craft. The men working on the Los Angeles Aqueduct were skilled tradesmen. The mauling crews knew exactly how to drive a stave without splitting it. The banding crews knew exactly how tight to set an iron band to hold pressure without crushing the wood underneath. The caulking crews knew exactly how much oakum and pitch to drive into a seam to seal it without warping the joint. These were not interchangeable laborers. They were a workforce that had spent decades on canal construction, lumber mill operation, barrel cooperage, and railroad assembly across the western United States. The Los Angeles Aqueduct was the largest single deployment of that workforce in American history up to that point, and the engineering depended on every one of them doing their part of the work correctly. The biggest single challenge in the 80-mile wooden section was thermal management. The Mojave Desert in 1910 regularly hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. At night, it dropped to 40 degrees in the winter. The Douglas fir absorbed and released moisture with the daily and seasonal cycles. The iron bands expanded in heat and contracted in cold. The total movement across the pipe length over a year added up to several inches of linear expansion and contraction. If the joints could not handle that movement, the pipe would leak, the staves would warp, the bands would loosen, and the pipe would fail. Mulholland's solution was to specify a particular grade of clear-grained Douglas fir from old-growth forests in Oregon, where the trees had grown slowly enough to produce dense, straight, knot-free wood. He specified a particular asphaltic pitch compound for the joints that remained flexible at desert temperatures. He specified iron bands with a particular tensile strength and a particular spacing along the pipe. The engineering specifications ran to hundreds of pages. The Frederick Finkel calculations preserved at the Department of Water and Power archives include detailed analyses of thermal stress at every diameter and gradient along the pipeline route. Finkel calculated the worst-case combined effects of summer noon temperatures, daily temperature swings, seasonal moisture cycles, internal pressure variation under water flow, and wind loading on the exposed pipe sections. He concluded that the wooden pipe could survive these stresses for at least 50 years if the specifications were followed exactly. He turned out to be conservative. The pipe lasted 90. The work proceeded in fits and starts. Crews would be ahead of schedule on one section and behind on another. Storms in the high country would slow stave delivery from Oregon. Labor disputes would close camps for weeks. Equipment failures would idle entire crews. But the project kept moving forward. By 1911, most of the 80-mile wooden section was assembled. By 1912, water was being tested in the upper segments. By 1913, the entire 233-mile aqueduct was complete. On November 5, 1913, Mulholland stood at the Cascades outlet in the San Fernando Valley as the first water flowed down into the holding reservoirs. His ceremonial line that day was 4 words. "There it is. Take it." 6 words, actually. "There it is. Take it." The crowd cheered. The bands played. The newspapers ran the photograph nationwide. Los Angeles had its water, and in the deserts to the north, the 80-mile wooden pipeline began the operation it had been designed for. Water flowed through Douglas fir staves at gravity pressure, day after day, year after year. The pipe did not leak in volumes that mattered. The joints held. The bands stayed tight. The wood did not crack. Mulholland's engineering specifications had worked. The 50-year service life he had projected turned out to be conservative. The pipe ran for 90 years in some sections. If you are new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you do not miss the next video. We publish 2 videos per day this week. Now we walk through what happened to the wooden pipeline over the next century, and why some sections are still in service today. The Owens Valley water conflict, which became the political and cultural shorthand for the aqueduct in popular memory, started almost immediately after the aqueduct opened. The Owens Valley farmers, who had sold their water rights to Fred Eaton in the early 1900s, discovered that the city was diverting more water than the original contracts had specified. The Owens River dropped. Owens Lake, which had been a substantial body of water before the aqueduct, dried up by the late 1920s. Dust storms from the dry lake bed blew across the eastern Sierra and reached Reno and Las Vegas. Farmers in the Owens Valley sabotaged sections of the aqueduct several times in the 1920s, blowing up the no-name siphon at the Alabama gates in 1924. Mulholland personally went up to the Owens Valley with a Los Angeles police escort to deal with the dynamiting. The aqueduct was repaired within weeks. The dynamiters were never charged because the local Inyo County prosecutor declined to file charges against his own constituents. The story became the basis of the 1974 film Chinatown, which fictionalized many of the elements. The conflict is its own video. We will not litigate the politics today. We will stay on the engineering. The engineering is what survived. The wooden stavepipe sections of the aqueduct, the ones built between 1908 and 1913, kept running. Maintenance crews from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the successor agency to Mulholland's original Department of Water, ran annual inspection passes along the entire 233-mile route. Where staves had finally split or warped, individual staves were replaced. Where iron bands had corroded, they were replaced. Where joints had developed leaks, the asphaltic pitch was reworked. The pipe was treated as a maintained living infrastructure asset, not as a fixed installation. Over the decades, sections were replaced when full structural failure approached. The first major replacement began in the 1970s, when sections of the original Douglas fir had been in continuous service for 60 years. The Department of Water and Power replaced those sections with welded steel pipe or with cast-in-place concrete. By the 1990s, most of the original 80-mile wooden section had been replaced, but not all of it. Some segments of the original Douglas fir stave pipe, installed during the construction of 1908 to 1913, were still in active service into the 2010s. A few short sections are reportedly still in service today. The maintenance records preserved at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power archives document the longevity of the wood. Inspection logs from the 1950s describe staves that had been in service for 40 years and were still structurally sound. Inspection logs from the 1980s describe staves that had been in service for 70 years and were still holding pressure. The Douglas fir performed better than Mulholland had projected. The asphaltic pitch joint compound held up better than the engineering specifications had predicted. The iron bands corroded slowly because the dry desert air did not provide enough moisture to drive rust. The wood paradoxically was protected by the desert. Wet climates would have rotted Douglas fir of this thickness in 20 to 30 years. The Mojave preserved it. The desert dryness that made the original construction difficult became the desert dryness that preserved the pipeline far longer than any wet climate water pipe of the same era. The construction precedent of the Los Angeles Aqueduct influenced almost every major western United States water project that followed. The Hetch Hetchy system, which Bay Area engineers built between 1913 and 1934 to deliver Sierra water to San Francisco, used many of the same stave pipe techniques in its lower sections. The Mono Lake extension of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, built in the 1930s under the same Department of Water and Power, used the same engineering approach over the next 105 miles. The Boulder Canyon project, which became Hoover Dam, drew engineering staff from the Los Angeles Department of Water who had cut their teeth on Mulholland's aqueduct. The All-American Canal, which carries Colorado River water to the Imperial Valley in California, learned its grading and channel management methods from the original aqueduct surveys. The Salton Sea Outlet Drainage System, which manages the agricultural runoff of the Imperial Valley, learned its open canal evaporation calculations from the high desert sections of the original Los Angeles Aqueduct. The Bureau of Reclamation Engineers, who designed the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project, decades later trained on the engineering methods of the Los Angeles Aqueduct. The pre-modern engineering of 1908 to 1913 set the standard for everything that came after. What is remarkable in retrospect is not just that Mulholland and his crews built the 80-mile wooden pipeline. It is that they built it correctly the first time. Most large-scale engineering projects of the early 1900s had to be partially redone within 15 or 20 years because the original design proved inadequate. The Los Angeles aqueduct did not need that kind of major redesign. Mulholland had specified the right wood, the right banding, the right joint compound, the right grading, the right tunnel diameters, the right siphon depths. The water flowed when it was supposed to flow. The pipe held when it was supposed to hold. The aqueduct opened on schedule, and within 10% of its original budget of $23 million, which in 1913 dollars equals roughly $740 million today. A modern engineering project of comparable scale would typically run over budget and behind schedule. Mulholland did not have that luxury. He had a fixed bond issue from the Los Angeles taxpayers and a fixed delivery deadline written into the city's growth plans. He delivered. The 5,000 workers who built the aqueduct are mostly anonymous to the modern historical record. Construction camp records were not preserved with the detail of modern personnel files. We know rough numbers and rough demographics. We know the camp foreman by name in many cases. We know a few of the mule team drivers, the surveyors, the tunnel boss for the Elizabeth Tunnel through the San Gabriels named John Gray, the construction superintendent of the Jawbone Siphon section, the chief blasting foreman for the Upper Owens Valley tunnels. We know almost none of the men who actually swung the mauls that drove the Staves home. They were paid $2 per day in 1909, dropping to $1.50 in the labor surplus that followed. They worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week. They slept in tents or bunkhouses depending on the camp. They ate beans, salt pork, sourdough biscuits, and whatever fresh produce the supply train brought down from the north. The cookhouses ran 24-hour kitchens that produced about 4,000 pounds of bread, 2,000 pounds of salt pork, and 1,000 gallons of coffee per camp per week at peak. Some of the men died. Construction deaths on the aqueduct are documented at 43 men over the 5-year span, mostly from tunnel accidents, blasting accidents, the Jawbone Siphon scaffolding collapse, and a few cases of heat stroke and pneumonia. The 43 are buried in small cemeteries along the construction route from the Owens Valley down to the San Fernando Valley. Their headstones, where they still exist, mostly list only first names and approximate dates. A few of the Italian, Greek, and Montenegrin workers were repatriated for burial in their home countries through the Adriatic shipping companies that had brought them west. William Mulholland himself outlived the aqueduct's first quarter-century of operation. He continued to serve as chief engineer of the Department of Water and Power through the 1920s. He oversaw the Mono Lake extension, the St. Francis Dam construction, the second Los Angeles aqueduct upgrades, and the early planning for the Colorado River water source that would eventually become the All-American Canal. On March 12, 1928, the St. Francis Dam in the San Francisco Canyon north of Los Angeles collapsed catastrophically. The dam had been completed only 2 years earlier under Mulholland's personal engineering supervision. The collapse killed at least 400 people in the San Francisco and Santa Clara River valleys downstream. It was the worst civil engineering disaster in American history up to that date. Mulholland accepted personal responsibility for the failure in his testimony to the Los Angeles County Coroner's Inquest. The dam was a separate Los Angeles project, not part of the aqueduct, but the collapse destroyed Mulholland's professional reputation and his personal sense of purpose. He retired from the Department of Water and Power within months. He spent the last 7 years of his life mostly in seclusion in Los Angeles. He died on July 22, 1935 at the age of 79. The St. Francis Dam was never rebuilt. The aqueduct, including the wooden stave pipe sections, kept operating regardless of his personal trajectory. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end. The Los Angeles Aqueduct is still in operation today, 112 years after Mulholland's ceremonial line at the Cascades. Sections of the original Douglas fir stave pipe survived for 90 years. Modern engineers replaced them with concrete or welded steel only when the wood finally gave out. The Department of Water and Power archives still hold the construction photographs. The 5,000 men who worked through 5 summers in the desert are mostly lost to history. The 43 who died are buried in small cemeteries along the route. The water they delivered is still arriving in Los Angeles every day. If a modern engineering team tried to build an 80-mile wooden water pipeline by hand today, with 5,000 workers swinging mauls across the Mojave Desert, the project would not be finished in 5 years. Modern liability law alone would prevent the labor model. Modern environmental review alone would prevent the surveying timeline. Modern materials availability would prevent the Stave pipe sourcing. The aqueduct could not be built today the way it was built in 1908. The records prove it. The pipe is still there.